music writers, publishers, and book lovers to Clarence, the whisper beneath the marble floors. It began quietly, as all royal secrets do, beneath the veined ceilings of Clarence House, where the scent of polished oak mingles with the faint echo of history. Something began to stir. The palace had always been a fortress of grace and control, where every smile was measured and every silence deliberate. Yet beneath its marble floors ran corridors of rumor, and in those corridors one whisper took on the shape of danger. The whisper spoke of a vault, not a treasury of jewels or gold, but of memory, a chamber belonging not to the crown itself, but to the queen consort, a hidden place sealed by ritual and guarded by trust, where papers and relics lay untouched by official hands. Few within the household had ever seen it. Fewer still dared to mention it aloud, for within its walls, they said, rested the kind of truth that could crack the serenity of the monarchy itself. Among those who knew of its existence was a woman named Eleanor Finch. To most, she was invisible, one of the countless attendants whose work sustained the illusion of royal perfection. For over 2 decades, Eleanor had polished silver, pressed silks, and arranged flowers for kings and queens without so much as a word of recognition. Her loyalty was legendary, her presence as constant as the ticking of the state clocks. Yet even the most loyal heart, when burdened by conscience, may tremble beneath the weight of what it knows. Eleanor's discovery was not born of curiosity, but of circumstance. It happened on a rain-soaked evening, when the queen consort dismissed her aides earlier than usual. The corridors were dim and still, the air thick with the hush that falls only when royalty wishes to be alone. Eleanor, assigned to tidy the adjoining room, heard the faint scrape of metal upon stone. She hesitated. Through the half-open door, she caught a glimpse of Camilla's reflection in a gilt mirror, shoulders tense, her breath visible in the cold lamplight. The queen consort knelt before an iron-bound chest, small enough to be carried, but heavy with age. Its brass lock gleamed as she turned a slender key that hung from a chain around her neck. Eleanor watched as the lid creaked open, and Camilla withdrew a single velvet folder. The queen's expression softened into something fragile. Grief, perhaps, or fear. She traced her fingers along a document inside, and for a moment her composure fractured. Her hand trembled. A tear, quick and soundless, touched the paper before she closed it again. That was the first time Eleanor saw the vault key. In the days that followed, the house was quieter than usual. The queen consort's private secretary began canceling minor appointments, and the senior attendants whispered of an upcoming review of household staff. It was nothing unusual in the language of the palace, yet something about the timing made Eleanor uneasy. Each morning she passed the same corridor outside the queen's chambers and felt a pressure in the air, a kind of watchful silence. She could not unsee what she had witnessed. Curiosity warred with duty, and duty, she found, was losing. The palace had its own rhythm, the clinking of teacups, the rustle of uniforms, the distant hum of reporters waiting beyond the gates. But now that rhythm falters. A rumor circulated that a small group of aides had been reassigned. Suddenly, their departures unannounced, Eleanor overheard 2 guards discussing the letters and the ledger phrases spoken in lowered voices, as if invoking a forbidden name. To most, such murmurs meant nothing, but to Eleanor, they sounded like the faint echo of a coming storm. Late one afternoon, while tending to the queen's sitting room, she noticed something peculiar. A faint indentation on the carpet, a square outline small, just beneath the corner cabinet. She moved it carefully aside. Beneath was a concealed panel with a hidden latch. Her breath caught. The vault, she realized, was not only beneath the house. It had an access point here in plain sight. She dared not open it, but the knowledge of its presence filled her with a trembling certainty. She was standing at the threshold of the monarchy's most guarded secret. It was then that Elaliner made her choice. She could remain silent and preserve the peace she had served for 20 years, or she could reveal what she knew to someone who might understand its weight. That night, unable to sleep, she walked to her small servant's quarters and retrieved an address from a drawer. It belonged to Thomas Avery, a retired archivist once employed by the late Queen. He was a man of discretion and history, known for his quiet wisdom and refusal to gossip. If anyone could advise her without causing scandal, it was him. Their meeting took place 3 days later at a modest cafe just off the mall under the pretense of old acquaintances. Elaliner arrived first, clutching a folded envelope that contained her written account. When Thomas appeared, his face lined with age and curiosity, she felt both relief and fear. Over tea, she spoke in careful tones, describing the vault, the chest, and the documents she had glimpsed. She mentioned the velvet folder, the initials engraved upon the box, and the strange note she had later seen atop the Queen's desk. He must never know the cost of silence. Thomas listened, saying little. When she finished, he asked only one question. "Are you certain what you saw was real?" Elaliner nodded, "As certain as I am that I'll regret telling you." He exhaled slowly and warned her of the danger. The monarchy, he said, had survived centuries because its walls held firm against curiosity. Secrets were not destroyed. They were absorbed and sealed beneath layers of ceremony until they became myth. Once you pull at one thread, he cautioned, you will find the whole tapestry unraveling. Still, Elaliner insisted she could not live with the knowledge alone. Something in the Queen Consort's expression that night by the chest haunted her. It was not guilt. She said it was sorrow. The kind of sorrow that follows an old decision finally catching up with its maker. Whatever lies in that vault, Elaliner whispered, it was never meant to stay buried. As she spoke, a chill swept through the cafe. Outside, rain began to fall again, streaking the window with silver lines. Thomas closed his notebook and stared into his tea, deep in thought. At last, he said quietly, if what you say is true, then history itself is trembling beneath their feet. When Elinor returned to Clarence's house that evening, the palace seemed different. The lights burned lower. The corridors echoed with a kind of hollow grace. She passed the Queen Consort in the hall. Camilla offered a nod, polite but distant, her eyes unreadable. Elaliner curtsied, feeling her pulse race. The secret now lived between them, invisible yet undeniable. And as she resumed her duties, the faint ticking of the grand clock in the foyer sounded less like time passing and more like a countdown. For somewhere beneath those marble floors, hidden behind layers of silence and stone, something was waiting to be found. The hidden vault. Every monarch, it is said, has a sanctuary. For Camilla, Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, that sanctuary lay beneath the quiet grandeur of Clarence's house, a chamber almost mythical in its secrecy. Unlike the official archives at Windsor, or the secure vaults that hold the crown jewels, this one was personal. It existed outside the official registry, whispered only by those who served closest to her. Its entrance was disguised as a storage passage, guarded by an unmarked oak door. Behind it, a narrow stairway spiraled downward into cool stone. The air was heavy with the scent of age, polish, parchment, and the faintest trace of camphor. At the bottom waited the vault, a room no larger than a drawing study. paneled in dark cedar to protect against damp. There were no royal crests here, no grandeur, only quiet order. Dozens of boxes, uniform in shape, rested upon shelves. Each was labeled by hand, marked only with initials. One chest, however, drew the eye. It was darker than the rest, its brass corners dulled by years of handling. Upon its lid, the initials CR were engraved with delicate precision. Camilla kept its key upon her person at all times, strung on a fine chain beneath her blouse, a key that never left her possession, except perhaps in moments of deep trust or reckoning. Eleanor Finch had only seen the vault once years before during a rare maintenance inspection. Then she had thought little of it, but after that night, when she witnessed Camilla's tearful vigil before the iron chest, the vault's image refused to leave her mind. She began to notice the queen consort's pattern of how, on certain evenings when the house was near silent, Camilla would dismiss her attendants early, slip through the lower corridor, and descend the stairway alone. The visits were infrequent but deliberate. Whatever waited below required solitude. Eleanor's duties brought her near the vault again some weeks later. She was delivering documents to the royal secretary when she overheard fragments of conversation drifting through the half-open door of the study. Her Majesty insists the matter remains sealed, the secretary said in a low, urgent tone. Another voice, a man's, perhaps an advisor, replied, "But there are references to the late princess. If discovered, it could reignite every shadow from the past." The sound of paper rustled, followed by silence. Then came the unmistakable phrase, "It must never reach William." That name froze Eleanor in place. She backed away before anyone noticed, her heart pounding. In the hush of the corridor, the meaning of the word struck her like a tolling bell. Something in that vault concerned the Prince of Wales, something grave enough to merit concealment even from him. That evening, curiosity overcame fear. As she tidied the drawing room, she saw Camilla descending the stair once again, her face pale and drawn. The Queen carried a single envelope sealed with red wax. Eleanor, unable to resist, followed at a distance, remaining just beyond the turn of the corridor. Through the faint echo of her own breath, she heard the heavy latch of the vault door open and close. Minutes passed, then faintly came the creak of hinges, the shuffle of papers, and at last the sound of quiet weeping. Eleanor's hands trembled as she pressed her ear to the cool plaster. When the Queen finally emerged, she looked years older, the envelope gone. She locked the door behind her and disappeared up the stairs. When Eleanor dared approach, she found a small scrap of parchment left behind on the floor, half torn, but enough to read 3 words in Camilla's unmistakable hand. Private W. The next morning, the household was alive with tension, schedules shifted, meetings postponed, calls made in hushed voices. The royal secretary ordered an internal audit of archived correspondence. It was described as routine, yet no such odd. It had been scheduled before. 2 attendants were reassigned. A new electronic lock appeared upon the vault door, and from that day forward, no one but the Queen herself was permitted below. Still, word travels, even through silence. Rumors reached Kensington Whispers that the Queen consort was hiding documents tied to matters long thought settled. Prince William, occupied then with public duties, dismissed them at first as idle gossip, but something about the tone of the whispers unsettled him. One afternoon, an envelope without a sender arrived through the private post at Adelaide Cottage. Inside lay no letter, no signature, only a typed message on cream stationery. Seek what is hidden beneath her chamber. The truth was never buried, only delayed. The message was unsigned, the handwriting mechanical, the seal royal. It bore the faint scent of the palace's own stationary wax. William said nothing for 2 days. When he finally confided in Catherine, she urged calm, but even she sensed unease. "If you believe it's nonsense," she told him, "you'll sleep better," proving it so. But the prince did not sleep. In his study long after midnight, he read through old press clippings and archival notes from decades past, stories of intrigue, mismanagement, and grief. Each one seemed to echo a single theme, truth buried for the sake of stability. Meanwhile, at Clarence House, Camilla grew increasingly withdrawn. Her public smiles remained, but her laughter was brittle, her posture weary. Staff began to notice subtle changes. The curtains in her private quarters now drawn tighter, her handwriting more hurried. One evening, a footman overheard her whisper to her aide, "The past will not forgive us if it surfaces again." The aide merely replied, "Then we must ensure it does not." Eleanor, now burdened with the knowledge of what she had seen, grew fearful. She confided once more in Thomas Avery, the retired archivist. "It's worse than I thought," she told him, her voice shaking. "There are letters, maybe records of payments, perhaps even decisions made after Diana." Thomas, grave and methodical, warned her that she was treading upon royal fault lines. "To expose a secret is to challenge a kingdom's memory," he said quietly. "But if those secrets concern the rightful heir, the truth may not remain still for long." Days turned into weeks. Then came a night that would shift everything. A convoy of unmarked cars arrived at Clarence House well past midnight. Palace insiders claimed it was an unscheduled audit team from the Privy Council conducting inventory reconciliation. Yet those who worked below stairs recognized something else, a crisis disguised as procedure. For 6 hours, the vault door remained open under strict supervision. When it was sealed again at dawn, its contents were altered. The smallest chest, the one engraved CR, was said to have been moved. No explanation was offered. In the royal household, silence can mean anything. It can signal discretion, loyalty, or fear. In this case, it meant all three. By morning, a soft unease spread through London's corridors of power. Rumors reached as far as Downing Street, and one senior civil servant was overheard asking, "Has His Royal Highness been informed?" The answer came the next day when the Prince of Wales arrived unannounced at Clarence House, his car passing through the gates without ceremony. What followed behind those walls would mark the beginning of a confrontation. The public was never meant to see a reckoning not only between 2 generations of royalty, but between truth and the centuries-old machinery designed to contain it. And far below, in that cedar-lined chamber, the air was still. The faint scent of candle wax lingered. The vault, Camilla's hidden sanctuary, was no longer just a room. It had become a symbol of everything the monarchy wished to forget. The discovery, morning light fell pale and cold over Clarence House, stretching long through the corridors like silent accusation. London itself seemed to sense that something had shifted inside those walls. The press knew nothing, yet the atmosphere outside the gates was restless, as though the wind carried rumor before words could find it. Within, the royal household was unnervingly quiet. Staff walked briskly, but avoided eye contact. The Queen Consort remained unseen, and her private secretary moved through the halls with an anxious grace. Behind closed doors, messages passed between aides with the delicacy of diplomacy. It was in this stillness that the Prince of Wales arrived. William had not announced his visit. His car pulled discreetly into the courtyard, and he stepped out with a calm that belied his thoughts. Those who saw him described a man composed yet marked by some inner tension, a man arriving not to accuse but to understand. He requested no escort, no press liaison, only a quiet word with his stepmother. Camilla received him in her private drawing room. The meeting was recorded in the household log as family discussion, but what transpired within that hour was far from familial ease. Two voices, one measured, the other strained, echoed behind heavy doors. At times there was silence, long, deliberate pauses, where truth seemed to hang between them. When William emerged, his face was pale, his eyes distant. He gave no statement. He simply walked past the household staff and out into the waiting car, his posture rigid as marble. No one knew what he had learned, but everyone knew something had broken. That same afternoon, the internal audit resumed, this time under official pretext. The Queen Consort's private vault, sealed again only weeks before, was reopened on the King's quiet approval. The staff on duty that night described the sound of the lock turning a slow, echoing metallic sigh that reverberated through the hall like a tolling bell. Two archivists and a security officer descended the stairs under the supervision of the royal controller. For nearly 3 hours, the vault was examined. When they emerged, they carried nothing visible. Yet those who caught a glimpse swore that one of them held a folder bound in crimson velvet, the same kind of folder Eleanor Finch had once seen in Camilla's hands. By evening, word spread quietly among senior officials. Certain documents had been misfiled during previous archiving periods. It was an explanation tidy enough to pacify the procedure, but not the truth. The next morning, Clarence House issued a curt statement through its press office. Routine administrative matters have concluded successfully. No irregularities were found, but inside the palace, that sentence rang hollow. Hours later, William summoned his private secretary to Windsor. The man, loyal and discreet, entered the study to find the prince sitting before a small fire, the crimson folder on the table beside him. The room smelled faintly of old paper and the rain-soaked air that seeped through the windows. William did not rise. He simply said, "You should see this." Inside were documents of surprising ordinariness, receipts, letters, handwritten notes. But their ordinariness made them all the more damning. Some dated back over 2 decades, carrying the names of intermediaries and charitable trusts whose ledgers had long since closed. They traced a subtle but deliberate pattern of transfers of money, moved quietly through hands both familiar and forgotten. There were letters from a senior royal advisor, voicing concern about sensitive compensations after the tragedy that had reshaped the monarchy. Others bore signatures, some blurred, others unmistakable, and one written in Camilla's own hand read, "This remains our burden to keep. The public must never relive the cost." The weight of it pressed heavily upon him. William sat in silence, turning the paper slowly, as if each word aged him further. His father's image of a dignified, steady yet haunted, rose before him. He closed the folder and pressed his hands together, his eyes fixed on the flames. "We've spent our lives rebuilding what they broke," he murmured, "and still the cracks keep showing." His secretary hesitated. "Will you bring it forward, sir?" William shook his head. "Not yet. To expose this would destroy more than it would heal." He leaned back, exhaustion clouding his voice, but the truth has its own way of waiting. The next day, Clarence House initiated an abrupt staff rotation. 3 aides were transferred to distant offices, their records sealed. Camilla herself canceled 2 public appearances, citing fatigue. Behind the scenes, her demeanor hardened. Those close to her said she spoke less, smiled rarely, and began to lock even her study drawers. A quiet paranoia had set in, though she masked it with royal precision. Eleanor Finch, the maid, whose conscience had begun the unraveling, was gone by then, transferred to a rural estate for rest and recovery. But before she left, she entrusted her copies to Thomas Avery, the archivist. He stored them in a sealed envelope marked only by a phrase a Llewellyn had written. Truth, when hidden, corrodes. By the time whispers reached the press, the palace had already tightened its defenses. Any inquiry was met with courteous dismissal. Yet reporters began to notice subtle inconsistencies, overlapping financial disclosures, missing references in charity statements, untraceable benefactors. Nothing conclusive, just enough to feed the quiet suspicion that something unspoken lurked beneath the royal calm. At Windsor, William remained withdrawn. Catherine, noticing the weight upon him, asked one night as they walked the grounds, "Did you find what you were looking for?" He paused, his gaze drifting across the lake where the reflection of the castle trembled in the water. "I found proof," he said softly, "but not peace." "What will you do?" she asked. His answer was simple, "I'll wait." Sometimes silence tells the truth louder than words. For a brief time that silence held. The monarchy's rhythm resumed banquets, visits, speeches. Yet those who knew the inner circle sensed an invisible fracture. Conversations paused when certain names were mentioned. Smiles were a shade too deliberate. Camilla's eyes, once confident, now flickered with the caution of one who guards too many keys. And in the archives, the crimson folder was moved once more, this time to a private vault at Windsor under the care of the Crown's legal custodian. Officially, it was recorded as sensitive historical material. Unofficially, it was known as the Finch dossier. To the public, nothing had changed, but behind the gilded facade, a quiet reckoning had begun. William had seen what the vault concealed. The evidence was real, the implications vast, and though he had chosen restraint, those close to him sensed that choice was temporary. As one palace aide would later whisper, when a prince learns the cost of silence, the crown itself begins to tremble. The vault had done its work. Its contents no longer slept in secrecy. They lived now in William's mind, unerasable and unforgettable. And though the queen consort carried on with perfect poise, she knew that one day the son of the woman whose ghost still haunted those halls might no longer choose to stay silent. Confrontation and consequence. Windsor Castle had weathered centuries of storms, fire, invasion, and scandal alike. Its great stones absorbing history with stoic grace, yet even within its thick walls, tension could be felt like a pulse beneath the floor. Servants moved with soft steps. Advisors spoke in measured tones. For weeks, the royal family's gathering had carried an unspoken unease, as though each word balanced upon an edge too fragile to disturb. The confrontation, when it finally came, was private. No press, no protocol, no cameras, just father and son Charles and William in a room lined with portraits of monarchs who had each carried their own burdens of silence. The king stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the rain that fell over the castle gardens. William sat opposite him, the crimson folder on the table between them. For a long moment neither spoke. "I expected this," the king said at last, his voice low, resigned rather than defensive. "It was only a matter of time." William's reply was quiet, controlled. "You knew about the vault." Charles turned, his face lined with fatigue. "Of course I knew. It was never meant to be a secret of malice, William. Some matters, some histories must rest unseen for the sake of those who still live." "The sake of those who live," William repeated almost to himself, "or the sake of those who rule." A silence fell heavily between them. The king's eyes flickered toward the folder. That vault contains remnants of an age long past, painful remnants. It was her choice to keep them guarded. She, William said, is now queen consort. That choice no longer belongs to her alone. Charles sighed, moving to pour 2 glasses of water. Your mother's memory is sacred, I know, but there are truths that wound the living while serving no justice to the dead. William looked at him, then truly looked, and yet it's the lies that wound forever. The king's hand paused midway to his glass. For a heartbeat, his composure faltered, then he straightened. You're your mother's son, he said softly, always reaching for honesty, even when the world demands discretion. I'm her son, William replied, and your heir, and that means I must learn when honesty becomes a duty. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the hills. The sound seemed to settle the conversation into an uneasy truce. The king said nothing more. When William rose to leave, the folder remained untouched on the table. That night, Camilla appeared at dinner, poised as ever, her gown immaculate, her tone light. Yet the glance she exchanged with Charles across the table spoke volumes. She knew the confrontation had reached her without a word spoken. The next morning, the queen consort's inner circle was quietly reduced. 2 senior aides resigned for personal reasons. A third was reassigned to Balmoral indefinitely. Within days, Clarence House released a formal statement about organizational restructuring. The public, ever curious, sensed intrigue. The tabloids speculated on power struggles, hinting at disagreements behind palace doors. Official spokespeople dismissed it as fabrication, but the tone was too defensive, the denial too polished. Camilla retreated from public view soon after. She was seen only once, leaving Clarence House under heavy security, her expression hidden behind dark glasses. Those who knew her said she had become quieter, though not defeated. She's holding her ground, whispered one quarter. But the weight of history has begun to press on her shoulders. For William, the days that followed were a test of restraint. He fulfilled his duties with unbroken composure, meeting foreign dignitaries, attending charity events, smiling for the cameras, but in private, his thoughts turned over and over. What did justice look like in a house built on secrecy? Could truth exist within a monarchy that had survived precisely by controlling its own narrative? At night, he walked the long corridors of Windsor, where portraits of ancestors stared down like judges. He thought of his mother as the grace in her rebellion, the price she paid for transparency. Perhaps, he murmured one night to Catherine, every crown is forged with silence, and every heir must decide which truths to keep. She placed a hand on his arm, and which to release, she said gently. Meanwhile, in the outer circles of power, the consequences rippled. The Treasury requested clarification over a set of historical donations, citing discrepancies in legacy accounts. It was a subtle move, an administrative inquiry disguised as bureaucracy, but those within the palace understood its origin. The ripple of the vault had reached the gates of government. The king, though outwardly composed, grew restless. His public engagements multiplied a deliberate show of control, but behind the calm facade, his temper flickered. One evening, during a private supper, he turned to his secretary and said with weary finality, "There will be no more vaults, no more ghosts. Seal it all." The command was carried out within days. The cedar chamber beneath Clarence House was emptied, its contents catalogued under restricted archive classification. The chest marked CR was moved once again, this time to the Royal Archives at Windsor. Its key surrendered not to Camilla, but to the keeper of the Privy Seal. To the public, this meant nothing, but to those within the palace, it was an unspoken declaration. The Queen Consort's era of private sanctuaries had ended. Still, the unease lingered. In the weeks that followed, gossip slipped through the cracks of discretion. Journalists caught wind of an internal review involving historic royal documents. One tabloid headline read, "Palace Papers Under Lock and Key." Though quickly dismissed, the suggestion ignited public curiosity. Commentators debated transparency, accountability, and the modern relevance of royal secrecy. The institution that had once commanded mystery now found itself suffocating beneath it. Through it all, Camilla maintained a dignified silence. She reappeared in public at a charity event, her expression serene, her voice steady. Yet observers noted a new distance in her demeanor. She no longer lingered for conversation. Her laughter, once effortless, now seemed rehearsed. As spring turned to summer, William requested a private audience with his father again, but this time not to confront. When the king agreed, the meeting took place not at Windsor, but at High Grove, far from the eyes of staff. Those present outside the door said the discussion lasted nearly 2 hours. When William left, he seemed lighter, though still grave. A single sentence was overheard as he departed. "Then we begin again with honesty, this time." No record exists of what was agreed that day, but changes soon followed. A quiet initiative began within the royal household. Modernize record-keeping, establish ethical oversight, and increase financial transparency. It was never linked publicly to the vault, but insiders understood. The heir had drawn his line, and the king, weary of ghosts, had conceded. As for Eleanor Finch, the maid whose courage had started it all, her name was struck from the staff registry. No dismissal, no public acknowledgement, simply absence. Some said she had settled in the countryside. Others whispered she had been placed under quiet protection. Thomas Avery, the archivist, who had kept her confidence, received a letter in handwriting he did not recognize. It contained only one sentence: the truth was not wasted. By late autumn, the royal family presented a united front once more. Public appearances resumed. Photographs filled newspapers and speeches praised unity and renewal. Yet beneath the surface, the memory of the vault remained an unspoken understanding among them that secrets once unearthed could never truly be buried again. And within William's study, the crimson folder remained on a single shelf, untouched yet ever present. He had promised to protect it, not to hide it, but to preserve it, as proof that even within the palace truth had once dared to breathe. For some, the confrontation had brought closure. For others, it had only opened the door to a new kind of vigilance. But for William, it had done something more profound. It had revealed the difference between silence and peace, and that perhaps was the greatest consequence of all. The silence before the storm. Winter arrived with a quiet ceremony, wrapping the palace grounds in frost and restraint. The royal family gathered once more at Sandringham as tradition demanded. It was meant to be a season of calm, a momentary return to form. The cameras waited by the gates, ready to capture the tableau of togetherness. The king, dignified as ever, the queen consort poised, and the prince and princess of Wales, radiant in their quiet composure. To the world it appeared as though harmony had been restored. Yet within those ancestral walls, the air carried a stillness too heavy to be peaceful. Dinner that evening was candle-lit, soft with the hum of polite conversation. Yet every glance seemed to weigh more than words. The king spoke of duty and endurance. Camilla smiled gently, offering small remarks. About the estate gardens, across the table William listened, his expression unreadable. His silence was not rebellion. It was reflection, deliberate and deep. Catherine sensed it, too. She sat beside him, her hand resting near his, a subtle anchor amid the performance of civility. When the last course was served, the king raised his glass in quiet benediction. "To my family," he said softly, "to continuity." They drank, and as the glasses touched, the sound was crisp, almost brittle. Continuity, William thought, was a word that had long served the crown, but rarely the truth. Later that night, when the corridors had emptied and the household had retired, William wandered the old gallery alone. The portraits lining the walls seemed to watch his ancestors, who had ruled, endured, concealed. He paused before one painting, a former monarch, remembered for his stoicism during scandal. The likeness seemed to whisper a question only the living could answer. How much silence can a throne bear? Before it cracks, from the far end of the gallery came a soft sound, the unmistakable rhythm of heels on stone. Camilla emerged from the shadows wrapped in a shawl, her expression faintly illuminated by the lamplight. She hesitated before speaking. "You're restless, I see." William inclined his head slightly. "Reflection keeps me awake." She smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed no warmth. "It does that to all of us." A long silence followed. Then she said, "You've seen everything, haven't you?" "I have," William replied, "and I understand more than you think." Camilla drew nearer, her voice quieter now. "Then you understand why it had to stay hidden." "I understand that secrecy can protect," he said evenly, "but it can also imprison." For the first time, her composure wavered. "You believe I kept those things for selfish reasons." He met her gaze steadily. "I believe you kept them because you were afraid of what the truth might cost." Her breath caught a flicker of recognition, perhaps even relief. "Then we are both prisoners of it," she said softly. "You for knowing, me for keeping." She turned away slightly, her voice falling to a whisper. "Your mother's ghost has never left this house. Every shadow reminds me." William's expression softened, though his tone remained firm. "Then let her rest. Let the truth rest with her." Camilla nodded faintly, her shoulders sinking under invisible weight. "You'll make a good king," she said after a pause, "because you care too much. But caring, William, can be dangerous when the world is watching." She walked away before he could answer. The echo of her steps lingered long after she disappeared down the corridor. William stood alone, his reflection flickering faintly in the glass of the old portraits. He understood her warning, but he also understood his calling. Leadership was not built upon comfort, but upon courage. The following weeks brought a strange calm. The vault was sealed permanently, its key now in the custody of the royal archivist. Official records made no mention of its contents nor of its history. The Finch dossier remained locked within Windsor, categorized as restricted correspondence. Eleanor Finch's name faded from memory, her story now myth within palace whispers. Yet those who had known her spoke of her with quiet reverence. A woman who had dared to disturb centuries of silence. Life at the palace resumed its careful rhythm. Public appearances multiplied, smiles returned to the front pages. The monarchy seemed steady once more, burnished in its practiced resilience. But beneath the surface, a subtle transformation had begun. The institution that had once survived by guarding its shadows now found itself illuminated by its own reckoning. William, though outwardly composed, had changed. His speeches carried new weight, his engagements deeper sincerity. When he spoke of duty, it was no longer inherited, it was chosen. He began championing transparency within royal patronages, quietly insisting on public accountability. His generation of aides understood the message. The new heir would not reign by secrecy, but by truth. Catherine stood beside him, her calm strength grounding his resolve. "You found your way through it," she said one evening as they looked out over the frosted lawns of Windsor. He nodded, his voice quiet. "I found peace not through forgetting, but through refusing to hide." Elsewhere, Camilla withdrew more into the background of royal life. Her public appearances became rarer, her statements briefer. When she did appear, her manner was polished yet subdued. Some saw weariness in her eyes, others saw wisdom. The vault, they said, had taken something from her, perhaps the illusion of safety that secrecy once gave. Still, she maintained her dignity, never once addressing the past that now hung like invisible fabric between them all. Years from that winter, historians would note subtle but lasting shifts in how the monarchy presented itself, its finances clearer, its archives accessible, its image less shrouded in mystery. They would trace that change not to a grand decree or reform act, but to a single moment of conscience, the whisper of a maid who refused to remain silent. And so the story endured not as scandal, but as lesson. Within every monarchy there are vaults, both literal and unseen. Some hold jewels, others hold shame. The difference lies in who dares to open them. For William, the truth became not a weapon, but a compass. He had learned that the crown's strength lay not in the walls that shielded it, but in the light that could pass through. And as he prepared for the years to come, he knew that leadership was not about guarding the past. It was about freeing the future from its shadow. One evening, as the chapel bells tolled softly across Windsor, William stood by the window of his study, the crimson folder before him once more. He opened it only briefly, his gaze resting on the words his stepmother had once written. He must never know the cost of silence. He smiled faintly, then closed it for the last time. "I know," he whispered, "and that's enough." Outside, the wind moved gently through the castle grounds, carrying the faint scent of winter roses. The past at last had exhaled. The vaults were closed, but the truth was no longer buried. It lived quietly in the conscience of the heir who had dared to face it, and in the echo of every servant step that had walked those marble floors before him. The silence that followed was not of fear, but of peace, the kind of silence that comes only when the truth has finally been heard. In the end, truth found its way through stone walls and guarded hearts. What began as a whisper became a reckoning that reshaped the crown itself. If you believe the past still speaks through royal silence, share this story and watch what unfolds when secrets are finally brought